Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this session titled What Women Want, which is on women and agency in the ancient world. And I think we'll be focusing more on the ancient world in terms of India. So, in the ancient times, as we know, from the ancient times, the representations of women have been about goddesses as well as about mortal women. And in the representations of the divine feminine, the goddesses have been depicted and worshipped as supremely powerful. Indeed, as you will hear in the course of the session, the goddess as Adi Shakti, as the creator animating and activating all creation. In numerous epics and writings, as well as in drama, there are notable women figures. Some are celebrated for their knowledge and ingenuity, some for their devotion and duty, and others, of course, for their beauty and immense sexual allure. The Kama Sutra refers to women and recognizes women as equal participants, and here I'm quoting from your introduction, Alka, as active participants in the rituals of erotic love. Okay. Now, of course, there are complexities and even contradictions in such portrayals, and I hope that we'll discuss those. All the three writers here have engaged with various aspects of women, their power, their desires, in narratives and verses from that ancient world. Their works, as you heard in the introduction, are very, very different. And so that makes this discussion quite fascinating because we're going to get very different perspectives on this topic. In Alka's case, based on the notions of karma, she's compiled wonderful paintings in 4 separate collections. One of them is specifically about the Naika. In Mani's case, she's translated wonderfully the Saundarya Lahari, which is a collection of verses about the Devi, the Shakti. And in the case of Amruta, she has this wonderful graphic novel. This is the most recent of her works. She has numerous wonderful graphic novels. But in this work, Aranyaka, she deals with the forest, women in the forest, women's appetites, desires, personalities. And in the case of Amruta, what's very interesting is that, of course, she's taken small episode from ancient texts and then developed them in very, very imaginative ways. So as you can see, there are 3 very different perspectives, but they all in some way deal with women in the ancient world. So to start with, I'm going to invite all 3 of them to very briefly sort of introduce their work through telling us what is for them the most important thing regarding women in their most recent works. So can we start with you, Alka? Hello?
Thank you, Minu, for that very succinct introduction and, putting us 3 very diverse women together in like a Ragamalika. Thank you. I would like to talk about the recent retellings of the kama or desire or the pleasure or the vilas of the erotic in pre-modern society. I think vilas or pleasure is one of the most basic emotions of humankind, be it men or women. And through many texts that I have read, it is generally accepted that the pleasure which a woman gets sometimes is even more intense than what a man gets. And what was very enjoyable for me, to read a lot of Sanskrit poetry, to read a lot of different, not just the Kama Sutra, but different interpretations of the Kama Sutra, was the fact that women had an active role to play, and it was not just a passive role. Because normally most of us think that the Kama Sutra is one little text. But when you go deeper into it, you realize that it is actually a compendium of 7 books which have been put together through many, many years. And in that, except for the first book, which is about dharma, artha, kama and moksha, where Kam is also one of the very important pillars of life, where there has to be a judicious balance of all 3 before, according to the Indic system, you get your final moksha. There is a lovely book which says, how do you steal another man's wife? And there is a book which is dedicated to the courtesan. And the courtesan is just not a commodity or a person which is there for a male sexual pleasure, but she's very much her own woman who, if we look at different cultures, one of the closest I can think is that of a geisha, but the geisha was more of a commodity, but a courtesan was a woman who knew all the 64 arts. She could hold her own. And one of the books in this, one of the chapters in the book which I loved was, how can you milk a wealthy lover, and how do you get rid of an unwanted lover? So it is interesting as you keep, dipping into what we call Indic wisdom or ancient poetry, which was written more so in Sanskrit. You see a whole kind of a feasting table or a movable feast of different characters or different women who very much held their own. And if we wear contemporary lens and look at those characters, we see that nothing much has really changed. It all depends on who the woman is, because we still are very much a hierarchical society, even amongst women, which caste, which community you come from. But the most important thing is how empowered you are. So when you look at the courtesans in the Kama Sutra, you find them to be people of great power, where important decisions were also taken. And in the Artha Shastra of Kautilya, which is much before even the Kama Sutra was written, there was what is not a very fair term to be used for women, but prostitutes, so commercial sex workers, also paid tax, and they were a very important part of society. So this is just a little kind of a, laying out of what it was in ancient societies, where the women were placed and how important they were, not only as in equal partnerships, but also how important they were in the whole cycle of vilas or pleasure.
Thank you, Alka. So, Mani, would you tell us what is very significant to you in your translation of Saundarya Lahari with regard to the depiction of the Devi?
Thank you so much. I would like to start by setting a context and sort of sketching what the mythical landscape turns out to be when women are concerned, usually. In Indian mythology, you find that, of course, you have goddesses, but the goddesses are usually benign wives. They are, beautiful looking, etc. Until you come to Shakti, until you come to Kali. And then Kali is depicted as the person who is not wearing the jewelry, who is not wearing those, in the illustrations and the depictions, we find that the feminine figure who has the power is not in the spousal relationship or the equation. It's very interesting for me, and it almost feels like a superimposition of human concerns onto mythical figures, right? But when you look at Shakti per se, very, very interestingly, mother is what comes to mind always. We always say Ma Shakti, and the adoration of mother goddess is very common in India. But if you read a source text like Saundarya Lahari, you understand to what extent that power is and how absolute that power is. How absolute it is that it is, Shakti is Brahman in Saundarya Lahari. You know, she is the cause and the effect. The entire material world is an embodiment of Shakti. That, therefore, includes men and women, you know. So the realization of the Shakti within all of us, that the feminine power is in all of us, male and female. And that is something that has to be tapped into. And a text like this, which is actually, it's 100 verses in praise of Shakti, apparently, written by Adi Shankara. And every commentary says Srimad Shankara Bhagavat Pada Virachita. So there's not like a lot of dispute among that, about that, especially among, I would say, in an sort of like an insider perspective. There's not a lot of debate about that, but there's no proof other than this as well. There are legends, of course. But, Shankara was obviously a male author, and placing Shakti in such an almost over-the-top position in Saundarya Lahari that all the gods bow down to her. You know, her foot pedestal is, her toenails their crowns are shining on her toenails. You know, when she walks, their crowns have to come out of the way. She is completely the boss. It is a complete counter-narrative to, what we are used to. And that's what I think is really very fascinating and interesting for us to dwell upon, and then see how it relates to society, how does it relate within oneself. You know, if you want to call a masculine and a feminine within oneself, how does that relate to it? What energies do you equate to what?
Thank you, Mani. So, Amruta, in your case, you've actually created the text and the images, right, in order to retell that story. So, could you briefly introduce us to the idea of women in that story?
There is a fundamental difference between the other people on this panel and what I am, which is that they come from a space of scholarly expertise. They come from a Pandita realm of things. And I come from the other spectrum, which is the wild beast that is the sadhak, basically. So all the bumps and prickliness and all the flaws and things that don't fit and the things that spill and the things that burn are all brought along with me, and what happens with the work is good and bad testament to that. So that is primary disclaimer. I'm going to request the tech team at this point that there is no point, guys, the ones who are going to be playing my slides. Are my slides up already on the screen? There is no point for me to talk about my work without showing it, because really what I have done is through the color, through the lines, and other stuff. I would have preferred to control the show myself with the slides, but at this point I'm just going to be saying next many, many times, so bear with me. What I have done in the work, so the first book was an urban contemporary queer book. Can we go to the next slide, please? Which was not at all about women from the past. It was about passionate, moody, fickle, temperamental Bombay girls in media space. So nothing to do with anything. Can we move to the next slide, please? Instantly after that book, there were two books that were based on the Mahabharat. So there was Adi Parva and Sauptik. The first one is Adi Parva here. Can we move to the next slide? And these are some of the images from that. Adi Parva was telling certain stories from the very first and the largest Parva of the Mahabharat. Now, the Mahabharat, because of the nature of what it is, goes through things like this. So my job as a person that was recounting stories from there was to hit pause buttons and to basically speak for what was between the lines, right? Next slide, please. More images from the Adi Parva. Now, Adi Parva was full of queens. It was full of unsentimental mothers, ambitious women, calculating, strategizing women, very mortal women, many of them, some of them celestial. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I have to be careful in gendering things when I talk about women in the stories that I'm dealing with, because we all know that gender is used as everything else as a metaphor. So while there are mortal women doing mortal things, there are goddesses doing goddess things, and often they cannot be equated with the same weighing scale. Otherwise, one ends up with very pedestrian readings of epics, as frequently happens. Can we move to the next slide, please? There is in all the stories, the goddess role is often as a circuit breaker. She's short-circuiting egoistical men who are building tapas. She is going about, it is a very mission-oriented kind of a presence, and it is a presence that is thus depicted. Apsaras are not vacuous bimbos. Apsaras are playing a certain role as you read the books. Can we please move on to the next slide, please? There is an aspiration in the mortal heroines for other sort of things, to accommodate one's pleasures, to accommodate one's drive to go towards the beloved. There is an aspiration on everybody's part to reach a dancing state of things. Can we move to the next slide, please? This is my third book, Sauptik, which has Draupadi on the cover. People expected it to have Draupadi having a burning place in the narrative, but in fact, twist of tale, it is Ashwathama, the wounded warrior, who holds the story for a very, very specific interest, which was that a story that talked about masculinity should not necessarily be told by the heroes, but by an injured man, and that does service in very different ways. Can we move to the next slide, please? We have in Sauptik women that appear with, again, varying desires to just have the beloved notice them, to engage with the world, to stop being such a self-absorbed person while the world falls apart and starves, and to come to domesticity and play a board game. Daughters-in-law that step out because they need to step out, regardless of who's waiting and what kind of threats and taunts pull them back. Can we move to the next slide, please? There are small subversions, and this I cannot tell you how many times in every book happens. As a reader, you will gauge. As an artist, what do I bring to the picture? As a woman who does graphic novels, which is an incredibly queer medium as mediums go, what do I bring to a story? So here there is Hidimba, as shown in Amar Chitrakatha to the left, and as shown in my graphic novel to the right. And you can see that the subversions do not often need to be explicitly stated. They are there for those that have the eyes to see. Can we have the next slide, please? Same here, alpha macho, unaccompanied male deity on the one side, and utter sweetness and union on the other. Again, what an artist can quietly do. You don't need to necessarily be screaming at the top of your voice to be doing what needs to be done. My allegiance is not to the purity of words that are kept in Bhandarkar Oriental Institute. It is to the need of the hour. And like any sutradhar, if I have you fall asleep, the fault is all mine. If I can have the pulse of what you're doing and tell stories that you need, that is my role. And in my books, I have tried to be true to that role of a sutradhar. Can we move to the next? Do we have time? just a couple of slides more. Move to the next slide, please. Lot of women. Coming to the last book, Aranyak. Can I go to the next slide, please? Now, this book is very interesting in its structure. Nothing to do with the Mahabharata universe. It takes a tiny little story from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where essentially we have Yajnavalkya, the sage, learned man, best in business. And he's got his Shishyas, he's got a very, very worthy opponent in Gargi. And there is a fleeting throwaway mention of his wife, Katyayani, who had the wisdom common to women. And now that is shade, if there ever was any shade. And the book actually takes this slender little thing and just asks the question, is wisdom really the preserve of classrooms? Or is a woman of large appetites who likes nothing more than to have sex and to feed people and to be fed? Is there wisdom to be had in this quadrant as well? And that is what the book analyzes, not just by putting this one figure in the forefront, but also talking about, can we move to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Using forest as a metaphor for what is within us, the things that drive us, the things that we fear, the things that we hunger for. Stories of three very different kind of women, but actually three different kinds of minds are told. There is one woman who wishes to be seen for her mind, so she will desexualize and eliminate all signs of beauty that the world give her mind a shot, as if the two things cannot come to the table at once. Can we move to the next slide, please? And then the very last slide of my presentation is the narrator Katyayani, the big woman of the big appetites. The turning point for her is when her eyes go from big Durga eyes to a more, bodhisattva kind of a wave of an eye. And she realizes that she is not me. And ergo, I do not need to gauge by that gauge, and she will never be me, and that needs to be understood. So these are the ways women have appeared in my work. They are, for me, not women from any ancient text. They are the now. They are human preoccupations of the now. Often mine, many times other people's as well. And that's what I do with my work continuously. Thank you.
Thanks, Amruta. So in all of your writings, and perhaps this is inevitable, there's a tension between the women with power, women with agency, women with desires, capable of, as Alka, as you write, of taking and giving pleasure. But they do operate within a patriarchal framework with certain constraints. So I'm very curious to know how you interpret and perceive those constraints in the ancient works that you've studied, and perhaps in your case, Amruta, whether in developing your stories and your images, you had to deal with this tension. So maybe we'll start with you, Amruta.
Yeah. Continuously, but this links back with what I see as the role of the Sutradhar. So if there is chaff and there's fluff and there's irrelevance, then instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what I do is I hold on to the essence and I cut out the stuff that doesn't hold. So it is a continuous dance. Like, I have problems with people that are subversive for the heck's sake of being subversive, but what is that? That's just brattiness. For me, the elegance and the beauty and the intelligence of all of this is to keep what is utterly sparkling and worth keeping, and to leave the rest. And that has happened continuously. And you know what happens? When you change the person that is behind the camera, who is taking pictures, when you change the person who is Sutradhar, the story cannot help but change. I mean, there is no question of me telling B.R. Chopra's Mahabharata. There's no question of me telling Anant Pai's stories of anything. Not to diss what anybody has done, but it can't. I mean, it comes through. And that is what I can do. Be authentic to that.
And Alka, in one of your books, you write in detail about the Naika, right? All her various moods and the ways in which she exercises her desires, seeking pleasure, in anguish over separation, and seems to be quite an autonomous figure. However, all these texts are written by men. And I wonder, what is the element of fantasy in it? Perhaps something about this notion of the woman adorning herself as she's waiting for the man. Is that in order to fulfill a certain male fantasy? Or do you still see the women empowered?
So, Minu, while I agree with you that this was definitely written by men, but I think the time in which it was written, perhaps the men were a little more evolved or the women were a little stronger, I don't know. But if you look at the Ashtanaikas, for example, and you see that a woman is adorning herself, you see how she's being subservient, you see all those things happening even today. Things haven't changed that much. What we talk of pre-modern society or what you say, ancient society, human nature doesn't really change very much. And it all depends what role the woman wants to play, what mood she is in. Does she want to adorn herself? I'm sure there are moments when I want to adorn myself for myself, you know. So it's not about just adorning yourself for the male. So maybe it could be that Keshava Das wrote it like that, or Bharat wrote the Naika Bhed, or Malik Muhammad Jaisi wrote about the Nakshik Varnan, how a woman adorned herself. So of course these are, I think to some extent, and this is my personal view, probably they're a very romanticized version of how the male is seeing the woman. But on the other hand, I would also take it like how the woman is comfortable with herself, the Naikas, for example. Because one of my major works has been the study of Ardhanari Ishwara. So in that it is the Lord who is half woman. So I believe in this concept of having both in a being. I think I have both the genders. Gender is fixed, but the aspect of sexuality, I can feel the stereotypical male one day when you say he's aggressive, he's controlling, he's powerful. Maybe I feel that someday. And maybe one day I feel more soft, more creative, more, you know, it depends on my mood. And I think it's something, it's literally a coming of age for a woman. So when we look at the title, what do women want? I think women just want to be comfortable in their own skin. And it takes a while to be there. Because we, within the Asian subcontinent, have been brought up as women of my generation to literally be subservient. You end up beginning by pleasing your parents, and you please your husband, then you please your children, and you're always so nervous about. But then a time comes and what people say, oh, be in the moment, love yourself first. So I think these are qualities which, if we go back to ancient societies, they pretty much had understood it better. It's over the years that, you know, modernization, the stress, the whole thing of definitely of patriarchy in the present moments in particular. That's why women have to fight and put definitions of, you know, femininity, feminism, all those things. I don't really believe too much in that. I believe in the woman, as Mani was saying, that she's all-powerful. She is Shakti. And it is up to her how she uses the power, which is also there in the men. But it is a different kind, through tradition and culture, it's a different kind of power. But I think it is how much we understand ourselves, how much we evolve our reasoning, that we harness the power which is within us. Because it is there in every being.
Thanks, Alka. And you referred to the power of Shakti, the Devi, and certainly it's present in Saundari Lahari, immense power of responsible for all creation. However, she is presented in relationship to the other gods, right? In relationship to her consort Shiva, to her father. How do you perceive these relationships within the text?
This book is a translation, so I am translating what the source text is. So I'm not obviously at liberty to change that. But the first step for me is to become aware of what it is. What is it that this work contains? On the one hand, you have the supremacy of Shakti. On the other hand, you have her relationship to Shiva, the fact that there is a spousal role, then she's the daughter of the mountain, she's Himavan's daughter. The family relationship is also something that is implied. Now, when we look at these things, of course, naturally, I mean, in our context today, we are immediately thinking, well, it was a male author, wasn't it? Or it was a social context, wasn't it? And that is the only way that we can take a guess at what it was, at the context. For example, look at Shakuntala in Kalidasa's work, and look at Shakuntala in Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, Shakuntala is more feisty. In Kalidasa's play, Shakuntala is not as feisty. So then we can come up with a reading, interpretation, conclusion. And of course, it's only based on these two evidences that perhaps in those times, women had more expressive power. But these are kind of like you pick a spot from here, you pick a spot from there, and you can extrapolate and create like trajectories of were they more liberated then or are they less liberated now. It's very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell. On the one hand, I find the whole narrative that is very fashionable today about, oh, well, women had so much equality once upon a time. You know, Rishika's, lists of Rishikas come out, Maitreyi is quoted, etc. I'm like, wait a minute, that was like an alimony, basically. The fact that he was going to leave and asked her, what does she want? And she said, she said to Yajnavalkya, I'd like to know the truth of what you know. But the fact is, he knew it first, you know. So we can read something any which way. It depends on what the purpose is. And so we need to look at it from multiple sides and become aware of what the work is. And I think that is the primary work, is to have a direct contact with our source texts, to know what is being said in it, and to think about it and engage with it. I don't know if we can come up with any conclusions per se.
So that takes me into another question that has fascinated me in your works. And again, this is something we're very familiar with. Thanks, Amruta, from the Indian context. That, you know, so much of the power and the pleasure of women, the desirability and the desiring of women, so much of it is presented in very vivid, compelling physical terms. But I think all of you underlined this point that there's a whole spiritual dimension within that and beyond that. Physical representation. So my question to all of you is, in the work that you've engaged with, the artworks, the texts, and in your case, the actual creation of the artwork and text, where you've dealt with, and again, Amruta, in your case, this very powerful, vivid woman with of great substance and physical impact, and that marvelous, abundant, flowing hair. And she has an enormous physical presence, as does the Devi and Sundarya Lahari, the Radha and all the other Nayikas. Yeah? So are there points at which the physical overwhelms any kind of spiritual meaning? Or is that spiritual, philosophical meaning, is that co-present, there's no dichotomy between the two, and it's possible to detect it?
In my work, clearly I see no split between the two things. And in fact, I shudder when there is too much of a split between, some kind of a disembodied godliness and coarse bodiliness. I don't like that dichotomy very much myself. And in fact, for my work that I'm on right now, I have been reading the Gatha Saptashati, which are these poems from Maharashtra. Basically, these are chicks from my part of the world, from a completely different era, and they are talking about the Godavari, and they're talking about rivers that are in the present, and the language and the way that they speak of their yearnings, their insecurities, their rages, their, petty grouses. Like, I feel very little, I feel engagement, not disengagement. They are not some kind of dinosaurs and fossils from some other point of time. They are full-blooded, passionate, bad-tempered. I mean, I think in that sense, my own affinity is clearly towards slightly bad-tempered village deities than with anything that is, desexualized and otherwise. So I personally find that there is a strong connection and a lack of dichotomy, which I would like to keep in my own explorations of this.
And Alka, the whole question of eroticism, women, and the spiritual meaning behind that.
So for me, the Geet Govind of Jaydev symbolizes really all the Can you hear me? Yeah. So for me, to a certain extent, the Geet Govind, the Ashtapadis, Jaydev's Geet Govind, it symbolizes really the deepest of sexual desire, the deepest of spirituality which you can see in it, because these were written by poets. It's like Nirguna Nirakar, Saguna Sakal. So these were done because when we started this, if you're a person of faith and you start worshipping the image of God, it was actually made in the image of man. So even the story of Radha and Krishna, which has been said in the songs done by Jaydev, Yahi Madhav, Yahi Keshava. If you look at all these other songs also, where he writes his name on her breast with his kalam, or they exchange clothes, it is the becoming, the oneness. And that oneness has a deep amount of spirituality to it. And it actually is a metaphor to some extent to the Advaita philosophy also. So the union of the Atma and Paramatma, which is seen in the physical manifestations of a sexual union. So it is just, what I would say is that unlike the Judeo-Christian philosophy where sex was only for procreation, within our system, Vilas is very much part of our sacred tradition. Every god has a consort, and there is a deep amount of, physical pleasures involved in that. In fact, Shiva and Parvati, Jagata Pitaru Vande Shiva Parvati, they are the primordial parents. And one of the myths associated with the writing of the Kama Sutra is that when Nandi heard the lovemaking of Shiva and Parvati, he whispered into, the earth. So these are all kind of deep. We are a land of storytelling, kathas. We are a land of, our mythologies are full of metaphors, deep symbolism and allegories. So I think this is the way we are.
No, can I also, I would like to comment on that, because obviously you've just walked straight into my subject in this, which is Tantra is all about embodiment. And there is no dichotomy between, the problem is in the word. When you say body and spiritual, there is a problem in that sort of binary, the creation of that as if contradiction. Because actually there is no real contradiction. In Indian thought, we talk about koshas. There is the Annamaya kosha, the body. There is Manomaya kosha, which is the mental body. You have then Pranamaya kosha is like a breath, a spirit, the life breath body. Then you have the Anandamaya kosha, which is bliss body. we are a conglomeration of different bodies, and body is not necessarily only physical. And the expression in Saundarya Lahari of perfection, which is the description of Shakti, is a creative expression of perfection itself, and is not to be seen, I believe, as not to be reduced to a physical body that is not complete with the wholeness that I'm talking about, which is our entire being, is a composite of all of this. And so the physical is an embodiment of and an expression of the spiritual. One of my favorite memories on this question is somebody asked my guru, actually, I have a spiritual question. Can I ask a spiritual question? And he said, what do you mean by spiritual question? All questions are spiritual.
In my own work, the underpinnings are very clearly also ecological. I mean, there is no keeping the connect with forest out. And the minute that happens, it becomes clear why some of these attempts to separate things are so ridiculous. Because what is going on in nature except people trying to figure out if something is your prey or something is your mate, if something must be killed in order that it keep you from being dead yourself. There is a continuous dealing with hunger, and there's a continuous dealing with a desire not to die. And extrapolate from that every other thing that you want under the planet, and you can see why there are no separations left anymore.
Yes, and I particularly like the aspect of Katyayani, which is not only her appetites for food and sex, but her desire to keep feeding people, which is so wonderful. We don't have very much time left, so I'd like to invite questions from the audience. And therefore, perhaps someone should go around with a microphone for those questions. But before that, if I can just very, very quickly get some insights from you or any one of you that's interested, because I did keep wondering as I was reading your text, how much of this is coming from an imagination which is both upper class and upper caste, and whether these kinds of female desires, power, etc., is available to all other women in India, ancient India, present-day India. Anyone like to take on that question briefly? Thanks.
I think I'll speak for myself. Definitely coming from a position of privilege, the fact that we can read, the fact that one can go to the Sanskrit texts, the fact that one has access to all this information, to libraries, we definitely come from a position of privilege. The fact that we are educated is a great privilege. I don't know, I don't want to bring in the caste factor, but I suppose the way you are nurtured, it also depends from the generation that I come. It's definitely becoming more and more democratic today. But in India, you really can't keep caste out. And as I was growing up, we had to recite all the Sanskrit shloks, whether we understood it or not, whether we were sent to the convent schools or not. But puja paat kar kar hi, we were allowed to eat. So that was part of the training, which is now slowly being erased, and people have more, I think, freedom to choose whether they want to follow being people of faith or they want to do what they want. So I'm only talking for myself. Definitely, I come from a position of privilege due to education, and therefore I have my own agency.
So, questions from the audience. Yeah, there's a hand up there.
My name is Chintan. Amruta, you spoke of graphic novels as a queer form and gender as metaphor. Do you mind speaking a little about that? Because your impatience with the literal and your turn towards the metaphorical is quite interesting. Also, you said that you like to hide the references. People usually like to highlight the references so that, they can show off what their influences are? Why do you do the opposite?
Chintan, I need to sit with you for dinner, Baba, to answer that. I don't hide the references at all. In fact, these are like extremely blatant love notes located everywhere from, everybody from Carl Sagan to Shams-e Tabrizi. They're all there. So I'm not sure that anything is being concealed for sure. And certainly the suggested reading at the end also unpacks some of that. Graphic novels are a queer medium for a very simple reason. I mean, they have been from the very outset. It's not considered literature enough. It's not highbrow enough. We try. Now and then people write PhD dissertations in the form. But by and large, it is still an underdog medium. It is a medium which uses literature in a very interesting way. It is a new language that has to be learned by people. It is the only boxes that it's comfortable sitting in, and even that I'm not comfortable setting my work in, are the rectangles that form a comic cases. So in every way, I find that it is an odd medium. It's a medium that sort of shape shifts and avoids definition. And certainly in the way that it's received by people also, it's an odd medium, if that explains. Yeah.
Other questions? No one else? Okay, right at the back.
I actually wanted to respond to what Alka said at the end, and also bring in something that Amruta had said before, which is, Gatha Saptashati is not about Brahmin women. That is the whole point of the text, in a sense. It's not even really about Hindu women. It's about merchants. It's about trade. I mean, all the women in the text, why are they so naughty? Because their husbands are away. They're traders. They're soldiers. So it comes from a very, very different universe. And it is a more visceral universe. And it is a universe of far greater sexual freedom and emotional freedom and all kinds of things. So I do want to say that even our ancient texts, the ones that we have, the ones that have been canonized, are inflected, and they are really quite nuanced. And we've also been talking about how all the texts we have are written by men, are male texts. That's because the men have been canonized. How do we know what women wrote? How do we know what we've lost? Yeah? I mean, there are allegedly 3 hymns in the Rig Veda that are written by women. Yes? So I think also, I mean, not to be like a naive feminist, it was all good for women before. But I think also not to be a blinkered person who doesn't see the erasures that have obviously marked literary histories and political histories and social histories.
Would any of you like to respond to that? I thought that was a very pertinent point.
Actually, what you said, Arsha, there's a lot of things that move me over there. One thing that is very important also is to acknowledge openly the blind spots and limitations that come of being a person of one's epoch and of one's place. And I know that in my own work, with each passing work, I have tried to address some of the wobbly bits and some of the sharp things that stuck out. But beyond that, it's work in progress, and this is precisely why there must be many sutradhars and many versions and nothing that is sealed into the book and the version of anything. I mean, that's the very nature of open source stuff, isn't it?
Anyone else? Alka?
I very much do agree with Arshia, because we really don't know. I'm sure there must have been many women writing, and they must have written. How do we know where their work was? Was it even allowed? Because you see, not only are the men canonized, I think they just take over. And they're still doing it today. So therefore, women have to really... No wonder they're getting so aggressive. So this is one of the things of, society which I suppose ultimately will find its own balance, unique balance.
Any other question in the final minute, I think, that we have left? Yes.
My question is for Amrita. I had two questions for you. The first is that you've dealt with the Mahabharata a lot, right? So, when you're dealing with an epic of this size, how do you decide what to take and which part to include in your story and what to not take on? And my second question is that since you've dealt with the Mahabharata a lot, I wanted to know what your thoughts on a character like Krishna are, since he's considered to be very surrounded by women, and since his gender is a point of, in many works, is a point of question.
About what one takes on, I think one cannot keep aside the fact that a person telling the story keeps revealing themselves in choices that are made. In my case, what attracted me to Adi Parva was, of course, the femininity and the genesis. Like, it's all a birthing. Everything is birthing there. And Sauptik to me is decimation. Like, it's a slender chapter, it's a bloody chapter. And so in a sense, they are very, each is not the other in the most glaring ways, whether in voluminousness or in terms of essential content. And because I like the idea of circles, I liked the water beginning and dissolution by fires, kind of like, it's in that way the two have been chosen. I think that is the best I can say for it. It is also a lifetime's work to try and take on everything in toto. So basically, I took what spoke to me and what addressed my issues at that point. About Krishna, I think Sauptik says a lot about the question that you asked. So I'd rather not have a pat conversation about that. But it is the polyphony, it is the complexity, it is the fact that there is no easy answer to everything that continuously comes through with the Krishna character, and I so love it. I am not interested in black-white kind of things, and one of the beauties of what even Arshia has done in her work is prove to us that even the Ramayana is not like that. Like, people would like to posit the Mahabharata as being this magnificent, rabble-rousing thing, and the Ramayana being the goody two-shoes thing. It's not like that. So it's that not like that quality of Krishna that I enjoy, and the quandaries that he puts any kind of people dealing with his person.
That's a wonderful comment with which to end this session. So thank you all. Thank you all for your wonderful work and for your participation in this panel.
And thank you, Minu, for your wonderful anchoring of this show. Thank you. Thank you so much.